You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, money, honey, yes, money, honey, yes, money, honey, if you want to stay here with me.
And that was Money Honey by Ella Mae Mawson. This is Marie McCary with Why Don't Economists here on BCB 106.6 FM, where we talk about alternative economics and different ways of looking at how the economy works. Well, 2017 was an interesting year, with more and more people becoming aware of how broken the present financial system is. And I think 2018 will be even more interesting, as it seems there is a movement within the establishment of the USA to finally get rid of all the corruption and all the parasites embedded in their economy. I'm sure there have been others following QAnon. Anyway, I often talk on this programme about how money is actually created, that private banks create money when they issue loans. The borrower signs a promise to pay, and this is a credit on the bank. So to create the matching debit, the bank just presses a few computer keys to create that money into the borrower's account. Money is a means of exchange, and this accountancy entry into the system thus becomes a means of exchange that can be used by the borrower to buy goods and services. Cash is created by the government, and that is debt-free, but it's only 3% of the money supply. 97% of the money supply are these accountancy entries. In a way, they could be looked at as fraudulent accountancy entries of the banks, but they're accepted as the means of exchange. If you want to know more about this, look at videos on positivemoney.org. Well, obviously, this power to create money out of thin air is a tremendous power, and it is guarded jealously. The academic discipline of economics, however, never considers this amazing power and how it could be used to help or to damage an economy. But this is beginning to change. We must remember that it is absolutely necessary that money is borrowed to enable its creation. So a successful manufacturing economy with a trade surplus, where a government has a really good tax base and does not need to borrow, and whose citizens are prosperous and can buy from their savings and not need to borrow neither, is absolutely appalling to the private banks. By far the best way to get borrowing into overdrive is to start wars. So the international banks encourage conflicts. They use their co-opted secret services such as the CIA to create incidents and then make sure that there are inflammatory reports on the controlled media to fan the flames. The banks then finance the arms of both sides of the conflict, and money is also made by heavy investment in the arms industry. So lots of borrowing for the arms sales, borrowing for the subsequent reconstruction, lots of money being created by the banks. Even better, in the aftermath of war, it is often possible to buy land and properties for pennies in the pound, and full advantage is taken of this. So the rich in the West are getting richer, but they're not really interested in accumulating more and more of these computer digits that they know are created out of nothing. They're more interested in using these digits to gain influence and power, to protect their interests and to own real wealth. That means land and companies that can be used to extract yet more money. The best, most secure companies are selling things that are absolutely necessary for life, like water and electricity. So the cabal use their influence to push for privatisation so they can own these companies. Even better are companies providing necessary services that are paid for by the actual government that has tax-raising powers. So health, education and transport infrastructure are real prizes. Such are the real reasons for privatisations. The money creators want to use their means of exchange to own real wealth. We've all known for a long time that it is a downright lie that privatised companies are more efficient. The US dollar, though, is the reserve currency, and this is an overwhelming power. And the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, is privately owned, so it is an absolute money-making machine. After the fall of the gold standard, the US created the petrodollar, which means that oil must be bought in dollars. and international trade must go through the dollar as an intermediary to be put through the International Payment System, SWIFT. This means that most governments hold a large proportion of their reserves in dollars. This creates a massive demand for the dollar, which has nothing to do with the state of the US economy. And it means that billions of dollars can be printed without any inflation. Other countries must sell their natural resources and their goods to obtain this privately created paper. Of course, cash doesn't earn interest, so government reserves are generally held in US government bonds. IOUs from the US government, which pay interest and allow the US government to vastly overspend without any problems. This overspend is not used to benefit the American people, but to maintain an overblown military to deter any government from stepping outside this structure. So we had Iraq, which started selling oil in euros, and we saw what happened there. And Libya was planning to issue a golden dinar for Africa to escape the predations of the dollar-controlled Western international system, finance system, that robbed them of their reserves. So they had to be destroyed also. Just after 9/11, General Wesley Clark was shown a paper within the Pentagon which showed that the intention was to go to war with 7 countries within the next 5 years. First Iraq, and these were followed by Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and the final country was to be Iran. Well, it is now 17 years later, so obviously it can be seen that they have succeeded up to a point, but are way behind schedule. And the efforts to overthrow the government of Syria and set up another Rothschild central bank have recently been defeated, as the Russians and Iranians finally drew a line. But we can see from recent news about Iran that they are still hoping to use the tried and tested formula of promoting violent protests, and when the government reacts, going in with the military to protect the rebels. Nobody ever questions the similar reactions of Western governments to violent protests. Anyway, this strategy has been called out and it's just not working anymore. The private banks are controlled by the central banks, and the central banks are controlled by the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Now, this is a strange, secretive entity that is outside the control of the Swiss government, the UN, or anything. There is nothing in existence that can make it reveal anything or bring it into account. A little bit strange as it nettles amongst so many democracies. Here in the UK, we have one of the oldest central banks, the Bank of England, and it was because of its capacity to create money that we gained the British Empire. It's situated in the City of London, another strange entity, a square mile that could easily be argued as not really being part of England. Because since the UK does not have a written constitution, the strangeness of its place in the British Constitution is never brought out into the open. It has its own police force, its own mayor, and the Queen herself has to ask permission to enter. There is a man called the Remembrancer who sits behind the Speaker in the House of Commons and whose job it is to look out for the interests of the city. And it is the city that controls the many British islands that operate as tax havens and rob governments of taxes, helping the cabal avoid paying any taxes, even though it is they that use the secret services and military for their own ends. It is the taxpayers who have to pay for and die for the interests of the appalling parasitical cabal. It also tells you something when you find out that the very day after Gaddafi was killed in Libya, the rebels felt the top priority was to form a Rothschild central bank. Of course, that's what rebels do. Let's not even mention the 144 tons of gold taken out of Libya soon after to be looked after by the US. Of course, the Department of Defense, Fort Knox and the CIA have never been audited. In fact, a recent report estimated that trillions are missing from the US military budget, as was admitted by Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, the day before 9/11. Of course, that news and that paperwork all disappeared. But there is something even worse than this, and that is the fact that the cabal want people with no empathy to be their minions, people who will be ruthless in their quest for wealth, people who can lie convincingly and can be very charming and manipulative. These people are high-functioning psychopaths, and very many of these people are paedophiles, as adults are just too much trouble. The cabal promotes these people within the financial sector, the media and politics. They make sure that they have compromising pictures of their paedophile activities, so they will do as they are told. There is a lot of paedophilia amongst the top layers of society, and this is totally believable in the UK when we think of recent scandals and the circles Jimmy Savile ran in, and it's all still mired down in commissions. Oh, this is such a sorry tale of corruption and evil, and the fact that we do not really live in democracies. But in 2018, there is hope. It seems that some of the US military have remembered their oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, both foreign and domestic, and are working to do just that and try to root out the corruption permeating much of the US system. They've got fed up of these endless wars for the benefit of international corporations and banks. They've got fed up of soldiers spending their time guarding the poppy fields of Afghanistan. They've got fed up of dropping weapons in Syria, which end up with ISIS and then are used to kill and maim their buddies. All this going on whilst life for ordinary citizens in the US is deteriorating. There is a fight back going on. The CIA was formed in 1947 and has been rogue from the beginning, not working for the benefits of the American people, but for the cabal. They organise coups or assassinate any leaders of countries that don't do as they are told, and they're very good at fomenting wars that the international banks so love. At the beginning, they had the benefit of the gold that the Japanese had taken from many occupied countries. This gold was not returned but used to fund the nefarious activities of the CIA. In recent decades, they have controlled the drugs trade, the cocaine from South America, and now the heroin from Afghanistan. The Taliban had almost eliminated poppy production in Afghanistan, but now they have record deals. Recently, there have been actions against the cabal, or what is also known as the deep state. They have been signalled by questions on internet message boards posted by Q. These questions have encouraged citizen researchers to find out more and more about how very deep the corruption goes. And things are happening, because late last year the heroin warehouses and laboratories in Afghanistan, which were protected under Obama, were finally bombed and put out of production. Also, the drops of military equipment to Syrian rebels was terminated, and very soon after, ISIS, a CIA creation, was defeated. There are now only tiny pockets of ISIS in both Syria and Iraq. Not that this is celebrated by the Western media. No film of Syrian Christians now being able to celebrate Christmas without fear. Most surprisingly to me is finding out from the research into these questions from Q that Kim Jong-un spent many years boarding at an extremely expensive school in Switzerland that also schools the Rothschilds and many other children from these very, very rich people. But when you think about the history of Korea, I mean, every settlement in North Korea was bombed in the Korean War in the 50s. Millions were killed. How easy to put someone in power who would provide stability and rail against the hated USA. Someone who could provide an excuse to have US military bases in neighbouring South Korea and Japan. Someone who would provide an excuse to have the US Navy patrolling surrounding seas. How useful to be in control of a country bordering both Russia and China and without them even realising. How useful to be in control of someone who could rattle a cage on cue when there was any talk of peace in the area or in the world, or any talk of decreasing military spending. You think the CIA left this very strategically located country to organise itself after being destroyed? It's unlikely. I spoke to my Japanese ex-husband about this, and he said he was not surprised, as it's long been suspected. And he said, well, where did you think it got all its technology from recently? So, makes you look at the news different now, won't it? Yes, remember the next time you read about the dangers of North Korea. It's true the CIA like to foment wars, but they will be very wary of losing such an asset. People are learning so much useful information by researching the questions posted by Q, and it reveals much deeper corruption than had been thought. That if you want to look at it yourself, all this is posted under the label The Calm Before the Storm, and there is a very good Reddit page outlining the posts and the ongoing research. It's also possible to find out more on Twitter if you follow hashtag Q-anon or hashtag CBTS, Calm Before the Storm. And there are many various YouTube videos, but it's been going for a few months now. So it seems that there have been many traps set for the cabal, and they've been falling into them without fail. The cabal think ordinary people are deficient in that they are ruled by emotions, whereas they think they're superior because they are not held back by empathy and emotions, and they just have to think rationally in their ruthless pursuit of their own interests. But they are full of the air of their own superiority, making them very predictable. And as QAnon keeps saying, these people are stupid. Many people thought Q was fake for a long time, and Q has said that there has to be some disinformation in the media to divert and trap the cabal and keep them complacent. But it has become indisputable that Q is close to the President of the US and is involved in intelligence, though certainly not the CIA, who are called the clowns in America. Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, who was instrumental in his release of emails that really started to show the depth of the corruption, has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for many years at vast expense to the British taxpayer in order to avoid deportation to the US and the appalling treatment meted out to whistleblowers by the Obama administration. It seems he is about to be pardoned by Trump and thus able to release yet more damaging information. The deep state was appalled by the election of Trump. They thought that with having the media completely sewn up, the constant vilification of Trump, and there's a lot of election rigging going on. But they hate him because he's not under their control. He's not been a member of their secret societies, and they have no incriminating photos. And he is already extremely wealthy. Even his ex-wives cannot be induced to dish any dirt. He didn't get to his position of wealth, though, without knowing how appalling the deep state is. And he keeps talking about the rampant corruption and of draining the swamp. And he likes to win. So there has been a non-stop strategy of vilification of him by the cabal-controlled media. Trump rails against fake news and uses Twitter as his only way to talk to the people unfiltered, which further enrages the cabal. So let's look at this issue of exactly who is fake news. About 2 years ago, an eminent German journalist, Udo Ulfkotter, wrote a book, Journalists for Hire, detailing how extensively the CIA controls the news. He had no family and was dying, so he didn't care anymore what they would do to him. Despite zero press coverage in Germany, the book was a success and was translated into English. But surprisingly, it's since disappeared. Udo died about a year ago, but there are many interviews with him on YouTube. So back to Trump. He might not be the smooth-talking, politically correct product of the system, but are all the insults hurled against him by the mainstream media actually true? We have to remember he has had to keep the cabal convinced that he is not a danger and to make out that he is as much ready for war as any. He has had to keep them diverted and to think they are winning whilst the traps were being set. He is deliberately all talk and very little action on the warmongering front. But look at Trump's actions rather than his words. He has stopped the appalling trade agreements which would have given power to multinational corporations over democratic governments. He stopped the arming of ISIS, which resulted in their very quick defeat. He has significantly damaged funding to the evil CIA by stopping the Afghan opium drug trade and stopping Saudi money from certain princes. There have also been massive arrests of paedophiles since he came into power, with thousands more arrested than has ever happened under Obama or Bush. As the arrests of more and more paedophile rings continues, they're gaining more and more intel on the paedophilia in the top layers, and it is very extensive. Nobody is 100% perfect, but he's done some pretty good stuff, which he gets zero credit for. So we really need to step back from the old ideas of left-wing versus right-wing, as this is used by the cabal to keep people uselessly arguing against each other. We need to think of the 99% gaining control of their lives from the 1%. The cabal, unfortunately, finds it much easier to infiltrate and manipulate the left wing, as people can easily be swayed by appealing to their empathy and emotions. Think about the Blairites. At least we had the opportunity to fight back here in the UK and elect Corbyn, much to the rage of the cabal. And we've also seen the vilification of Corbyn by the so-called independent media here. But the Democrats in the USA are very compromised, as has already been proven by emails that the defeat of Sanders was completely fixed. So we left-wingers, who want to see a better world for everybody, especially the poor, need to understand and get our heads around how evil the cabal is and how extensive is their manipulation and power, especially over the media. Maybe only a supremely confident personality like Trump could actually take them on. But what is very interesting indeed is in all this process is an executive order issued by Trump on the 21st of December. An executive order blocking the property of persons involved in serious human rights abuse or corruption. The order declared a state of national emergency and that any people or entities involved in human rights abuse or corruption are liable to have all their assets frozen. This state of emergency is to last for 60 days. Well, so important people are going to be arrested, and you can be sure that they will have extensive proof against them. And I think it will be difficult for empathetic people to contemplate the extent of the evil of these people, the hundreds of thousands who have died because of them, the children. Well, even if all this does not come to pass, the launch on January the 18th of the yuan-denominated futures contract to buy oil will ultimately cause a severe weakening of the petrodollar and the power of the cabal. The cabal are furious but are finding themselves unable to start a war this time. And now there is a whole alternative international financial architecture that has been developed by China, and already Iran, Russia and Venezuela are selling oil in yuan. It really helps that with this particular futures contract it is easy to buy physical gold in the Hong Kong or Shanghai physical gold exchanges. And it must be remembered that China is the biggest buyer of oil. This would not have been possible even a few years ago and shows the diminishing power of the US. Trump understands this and is planning to make the US more self-sufficient and bring manufacturing home, which is necessary as the dollar loses its value, imports become very expensive. I welcome this introduction of a multipolar world, as it will give more weight to the long-term thinking of the Orient, and it can't possibly be worse than the constant warmongering and division of the West. The Chinese have been very successful indeed in pulling hundreds of millions of their citizens out of poverty, whereas the West seems to prefer making its citizens poorer. So whichever way the power of the dollar is diminished, what can happen afterwards? Well, Mayor Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." So it is no good to take down all this corruption unless we change how money is created. The founders of the US knew this, and the US Constitution itself says that only Congress should create money, so governments must start issuing debt-free money. This has happened in the past. The UK had the Bradford pound, the US had the continental dollar, pre-war Germany had Mefo bills. The economists prospered, but it was all taken down. People worry about government debts, but if it's in the country's own currency, there is nothing to worry about. The Bank of Japan with QE has created money to buy over 50% of the Japanese government debt, and it has not, as many mainstream economists say, caused any inflation whatsoever. The money, the means of exchange, was actually created when the money was first borrowed. By paying off the debt, the money actually disappears from the money supply. These accountancy entries don't exist anymore. This is the case when all debts are paid back to the banks. The means of exchange, these accountancy entries that have been traded back and forth, disappear. So in fact, the government bank would then need to create more money really to ameliorate the sudden decrease in the money supply. Whereas private banks tend to lend to property and financial speculation, causing massive inflation in these areas, as we have seen in recent years, and thus making the rich richer, a government could create and spend money into the economy in ways that increase prosperity for all, by spending into infrastructure, into health, transportation, education, research, areas that employ lots of people, meaning that the money keeps circulating. Firms could get funding from local, regional or national public banks, banks that would nurture them through bad times and whose profits would go back into the community. Do economists ever study how Germany went from a basket case economy in 1933 to an economic powerhouse in 1938? In Austria, the turnaround only took 2 years. Well, the reasons for this economic miracle had to be suppressed. If you want to know why, look into the means of exchange that the government produced, the MEFO bill. So with debt-free money aimed at the real economy, we could all recover very quickly and all could prosper. After the crash of 2008, the present financialised economy is seriously tottering. The rescue of the banks by the governments was financed by unsustainable debt. And we have to remember that government debt is auctioned off to whoever offers the lowest rate of interest. So interest rates had to be low for governments to be able to service these new massive debts. And nobody can beat the central banks in auctions, as they just create the money, and they have been buying government debt for years now, keeping interest rates low. As I said before, the creation of money to buy government debt is not adding money to the money supply, and as can be seen in Japan, does not create inflation. So this money that the Japanese government owes to its own central bank is still counted as debt. Well, I don't know about you, but if I owe money to myself, I'm not really worried about it very much. And this is the case in every country. There's been QE everywhere, lots of governments owing money to their own central banks, but it's still counted as debt. This accountancy fraud and ridiculousness has to stop. And it's appalling that while QE is going on, not causing inflation, the mainstream media and politicians going on that we need austerity because the government can't afford this or that or the other because of the national debt. Ridiculous. We really have to understand the money system. Also, when it comes to the mainstream media going on about the national debt, do they ever talk about the humongous reserves that many countries have? If I had a debt but I had massive reserves in the bank, I'm also not too worried about it. But this is never taken into consideration. So it's only government debt denominated in a currency that it does not produce that is a problem. So that's developing countries that have debts in dollars from the IMF, or countries like Greece that had debt in euros. And what's really appalling is the ECB has been doing QE for a long time now, but just will not use it to really help Greece. The Fed in the USA has admitted to $12 trillion of QE, buying US and other countries' bonds and also equities. But it seems to me they are buying far more US bonds covertly. If you look at the .gov website showing foreign holders of US Treasuries, you see China and Japan at the top, as to be expected. But these are followed in the top 10 by small economies such as Ireland, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Hong Kong and Taiwan, and they seem to be buying treasuries at a ridiculous level in relation to their GDPs. This has got to be covert buying by the Fed, because if they bought that much debt openly, it would reveal the growing lack of confidence in the US economy and the US dollar. And normally this lack of confidence in a currency would reveal itself in more people buying gold and therefore the price of gold increasing. But this indicator is ruthlessly suppressed by naked short selling, which is why China had to set up a physical gold exchange in Shanghai and Hong Kong. But it is revealing itself in the increases in value of cryptocurrencies, which cannot be so easily manipulated and do respond to supply and demand. So whether what's happening with Q is true or not, the financialised system is failing and the cabal is not having much luck starting a war, so the war can be blamed and everything reset. We must be very wary of any warmongering propaganda and concentrate on our economies becoming self-sufficient, because Western currencies are likely to lose value and making imports much more expensive. This self-sufficiency can be achieved with government-issued debt-free money being issued into the real economy. Well, however the scenario plays out, there is no getting away from the idea that 2018 is going to be a very interesting year indeed. I find following Q-anon better than watching any thriller, not that I have a TV anyway. So a lot might have happened before the next Why Don't Economists in 4 weeks. So this is Marie McCary, and I leave you again with Money Honey by LMA Moss.
You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, money, honey, yes, money, honey, yes, money, honey, if you want to stay here